Hi, Denise.
Hey Courtney, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing? You're early.
I am. I showed up like 15 minutes early. I just didn't want to. I want to log on early and keep it on here. So
Okay, cool.
that's a great headshot of you. I love
Thank
that.
you. Thank you. Thank you. So it's funny. I've had headshots done, um, professional headshots done before, but that one, which ended up being one of my favorites, was taken at a convention where LinkedIn was there. And they were there in like the exhibit hall and they were taking pictures of folks and kind of walking them through how to optimize their LinkedIn profiles. And so yeah, I said, okay, yeah, I'll take a headshot. Definitely wasn't prepared, so to speak, to take it. Just on the spot said, okay, I'll do it. And there was no special props. There was the screen in the background or the backdrop, but you just sort of stood there and and then they snapped a picture with a camera in their hand. And it turned out to be cute. And I said, wow, this is one of the best pictures. And it was so sort of quick and spur of the moment. So you never know. But I think it's also a good idea to have for any kind of professional event to have someone there available
I
to take.
know. I have been meaning to get headshots. So I had gotten a photo taken
That's
years
right.
and years and years ago, right? Like basically after college, I got headshots, but those are so outdated at this point. So I don't even use that anymore. And then I was going to get them recently redone, but then I got my teeth fixed. I had done braces, so I was like, oh,
Mhm.
you know what? I'll wait until that. And so then the coronavirus happened. So
Right, and all
here we
your
are.
plans, right.
Oh, there's Lourdes.
Hi,
Hi, Lourdes, how are you?
good. How are you? Does everything look and sound okay? Because before I think I was on mute.
Let's see.
Great. That's a great background you have too. Very,
Oh, thanks.
a lot of
Everybody always
people I
says, like,
feel
are
like
you in your office?
I love seeing people's workspaces, and yours looks so tranquil and peaceful.
Thank you. I try.
Oh, goodness. Let's see here. I'm just loading up our presentation. I want to make sure. Okay. I think I'm going to use the headquarters backdrop today. Da-da-da. So people are coming on in. Welcome, everyone. Let's see here. Looks like we may be the only ones brave enough to turn our cameras on, Lourdes.
That's okay. Totally fine.
And I guess I'll need to do that soon. Speaking of which, let's see here. I've learned so much about Zoom and the Zoom technology in the last 6 weeks.
I know. I remember when I've had a Zoom account for years and I like never even used it as much as I have lately.
Yeah.
I see Leslie. Hi, Leslie.
Hi. Who am I seeing here? I can't get my screen to show me a better view. Here we
Well,
are.
I'm not on camera, but Denise Amaya is here.
Oh, that's what I thought. Hi, Denise.
Hi, Leslie. How
One
are
week.
you?
All right, there we go.
I've missed our opportunities to travel to meetings together.
I know. Hopefully that'll, in the next year, that'll start back up.
And I don't think that our EMT group had an opportunity to congratulate you on your engagement.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, I noticed it at the meeting. How could I miss it? It's beautiful. Have you set a date?
No, especially now with all.
Yeah, really. Well, I'm very happy for you. Alexa, stop. Hi, Courtney. I wanted to just sort of wave to you. I haven't seen you since, well, a couple of times. First of all, the first time was when we were out soliciting members from some fair on the street. But then I caught just a bit of a glimpse of you at the TED Talk. Have you been involved since then? You're off. You're mute. Yes?
Yes. So I was saying, yes, I'm muted and I'm trying to unmute myself. No, you're absolutely right. Two great, but very different settings that we had time to get to know each other. Yeah. So I haven't actually, I've still received the email communications. I've enjoyed the talks and our recording of the talks, with, I think, a little bit more gratification this time around because I had a little bit to do with making sure it was a successful and smooth day. But you know, the last thing I've heard about TEDx is the Roxbury session. So there was a license granted for Roxbury TEDx, and a good friend of mine is sort of heading that up. And so, so yeah, so to the extent I've been engaged, it's been on that front.
So Beacon Street is one that's been around for a long time, but it's all volunteer, and it's astounding how much they do. And but it's almost always a pickup game at the end, a big push and so forth, and they get amazing applicants. So they just need to jump in and find last minute coaches and so forth. So I haven't heard anything lately either.
Okay.
So
Okay.
you're not left out, that's for sure.
Okay, great. I had a great time. I mean, I felt like it was such an honor to participate in the way that we did. So much.
I'd like to get you involved earlier when you can have an opportunity to give input to the speakers during one of those last few weeks when they're refining their talk. So
yeah, that would be fantastic.
Yeah,
that would be great.
Super. I'll make sure you're on the right list if I manage to make it myself.
Okay, thanks, Leslie. I appreciate it. I really do. There's so much going on in Boston. So many opportunities to learn and grow and engage and connect.
Yep.
Let's see here. Okay, so we have, let's see if I can, 3, 12, 15. Yeah, 15. So we are expecting probably another 4 or 5 people, but we'll wait another minute and then we'll jump right in because I want to be respectful of everyone's time, including our amazing speaker.
Yes.
She's so amazing, you guys. So awesome.
Thank you for bringing her.
Absolutely. It's my honor and pleasure to bring her before you. Hopefully not for the last time. Hopefully there'll be other opportunities. If she says yes.
Oh yes, I'm very happy and I really appreciate the invitation. So big thank you to Courtney and to you guys as well.
Awesome. So it's ironic that Lourdes and I work for the same organization, but not at the same time. And there are several attorneys that I've met over the course. Over the course of the last 5 years or so, that I thought, oh, they're such amazing women, and then I found out we have that organization in common. So
no, I think we literally almost like overlapped by maybe like 2 to 3 months, but it was really, really all too short.
Really, really brief, exactly. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to session 4, believe it or not, session 4 of our board seat initiative online series. You may recall that we started off with the introduction to the board seat initiative, and then went from there to two parts to our board seat salon series, where we heard from 6 amazing women who were in board leadership across the greater Boston area. And so today we're going to take a bit of a pivot and go into more of a substantive discussion on board governance, what it means to be a director, but even more granular than that, a discussion on our responsibilities, as directors, both in our practice, in our time that we spend on the board, and the actual things we do, but also our legal duties and responsibilities as well. So before I jump into the substance of our talk, we're going to go over the mission of our organization, which is customary. So I'll read it for you, and I know everyone knows it, but we'll go over it again just so it's front of mind. So the Junior League of Boston is an organization of women committed to promoting volunteerism, developing the potential of women, and improving communities through the effective action and leadership of trained volunteers. I find that part of it so powerful. Its purpose is exclusively educational and charitable. Okay, so that's our mission. That's our constant goal. So to jump right into our session, let's see, I have a message here. Okay, 1 second here. Give me one technical difficulties. Okay, sure. So for everyone, you should be able to adjust the view of the slide content versus the video content on your device. So for example, on my device, it's full screen for me. I think for each of you, it depends on sort of how you want to set it up. If you look at the top of your screen, there should be some options. One looks like a grid. The other looks like 2 bars on top of one another. One is a single shot. So let me know. We just received a question. Let me know if you're able to figure that out. Good, great, 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 great. Okay. All right, so so we have 2 speakers. I'm one of them. You know me. We've done this together for a few times over the last several weeks or so. So I won't spend a lot of time telling you about myself. I will say that pertinent to or relevant to this discussion is my day-to-day job as corporate counsel, which means I'm a lawyer for corporations. And also probably longer than my legal career is my nonprofit leadership career, which started when I was a student, sitting on the board of trustees for 3 of the academic institutions that I attended. And I think that's really where my interest in the law came from board governance, go figure, and now it's become my career. So anyway, that's a little bit about me, but let's spend most of our time talking about our esteemed presenter, Lourdes German. So I'll read a little bit about her via her bio, because if I give it to her, she probably won't tell you very much. So I'm gonna tell you all the great stuff and then I'll turn it over to her. Okay, so Lourdes began her career as an attorney representing government entities and investment banks in their public finance transactions at the law firm of Palmer and Dodge, which is now Locke Lord LLP, which is the organization we have in common. Following that work, Lourdes helped co-create the public finance business division at Fidelity Investments as a vice president of municipal finance. At Fidelity, Lourdes helped lead the growth of the company's public finance division. She established and managed Fidelity's first New York office for public finance, and she developed Fidelity's national education program to educate investors with respect to the municipal market. Following Fidelity, Lourdes's professional experiences include serving as general counsel and vice president of research at the investment management company Breckenridge Capital Advisors, and serving as director of international and institute-wide initiatives at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. At the Lincoln Institute, Lourdes established the International and Institute-Wide Initiatives Department, directed the team and global programs of work with partners that included leading universities, the Pew Charitable Trust, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and others. Lourdes also directed the Institute's cross-disciplinary campaigns. She chaired the Institute-wide Reserve Fund and managed the staff supporting Institute-wide learning design. As an expert for the United Nations Habitat Policy Unit 5, Lourdes served as one of the authors who wrote the policy framework for the municipal finance to guide the United Nations New Urban Agenda in support of the Sustainable Development Goals. Outside of her work at Boston College, Lourdes serves as a special advisor to the president of the Lincoln Institute, providing consultative and strategic advice with respect to the organization's educational, international, and institute-wide programs. Lourdes also directs the Civic Innovation Project, a global thought leadership initiative focused on using technology to advance city-to-city learning. And she founded this and launched it in 2015. The CIP launched the Public Sector Leaders Forum series with the Microsoft Corporation in 2015 and 2016, and was recognized by Government CIO Outlook magazine in 2017 as one of the top 10 emerging innovative technology platforms in America focused on government citizen engagement. In addition, Lourdes serves as Governor Baker's appointed chair of the Massachusetts State Finance and Governance Board, serves on the board of the Rappaport Center for Law and Policy, and serves on the board of the United Way of Mass Bay. That's a heavy bio, Lourdes. That's incredible.
That's a much too kind introduction.
And in fact, it made me wonder, how does she even have the time to sit with us on this Wednesday afternoon? We are so grateful to start, but even more so grateful to understand all the responsibilities that you shoulder. So with that, I'm going to move right on into our talk. Ladies, Lourdes is going to lead. Lourdes, I will advance the slides for you, and I will interject as I see fit, where I think there are some points where we can kind of expound. That said, feel free to send your questions in via chat. We will stop for questions a few times through the presentation, but you go ahead and send your questions in as they come up, and we'll tee them up for our question breaks. Okay, Lourdes, turning it over to you.
Great, and thank you again to Courtney and the Junior League for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today and share anything that might be helpful as you consider board service. I think I'm personally passionate and committed about seeing more women in board seats and in leadership. So if this contributes to that, it's definitely a wonderful use of this next hour. So to start, I'll go over briefly what we're going to cover today and give you a roadmap to our agenda. And I credit Courtney with really providing guidance on what are the topics that are most relevant to you, and also the stage at which many of you are thinking about board service, which is either at the beginning or where you're probably maybe a couple of years into board service and you could pick up some pointers along the way. We're gonna, after doing an introduction of what it means to be a board member, we're gonna talk about just duties and responsibilities. You know, what does the job entail? The practical reality if you're sitting on two different types of boards that we've isolated. And then how do you prepare to fulfill specifically a governance function? Because I will add a disclaimer that there's a lot that we can talk about in this realm that can get super complex, but we really believe that we isolated what are the most important things from a governance and stewardship standpoint. And I also want to add that we recognize that the form, size, sophistication, and structure of boards varies immensely. So for those reasons, we're going to really focus on these isolated issues. But as Courtney said, the most important points are what are on your minds. So feel free to send questions and we'll do our best to answer all of them throughout this. And I will ask Courtney to advance to the next slide so we can begin. So just what are we going to cover and what's the scope of our conversation? As you heard, even from my bio and Courtney's and probably many others, there's a lot of different ways that the board member role can be fulfilled and be served in different types of organizations. Including nonprofits, corporations, education and higher institution organizations, government and foundations, amongst others not even included here. We're going to focus primarily on nonprofit board service, where you are serving a charitable organization. And that's because any one of these areas alone, believe it or not, could be its own webinar. But because we recognize that you might be curious about more than just nonprofit board service, what we will try to do is throughout different sections of the presentation, we'll stop and say, even though we've just described what it means to be on a nonprofit board from this standpoint, here's a little bit of how it might look different if we were thinking about these duties or this responsibility or this function if you were in a corporate board or if you are on a government board. And we won't be as comprehensive in view of time, but if that's an area that interests you, feel free to let Courtney know. And again, we'll be happy to be as responsive as we can. And certainly at the end, when we do a little bit of a recap, we'll focus on those differences more prominently. So if Courtney can advance to the next slide, please. What you are seeing here is a snapshot of a list that would provide the line in the sand between governance and support. And before we even dive into that list, I want to make sure that we have a shared understanding over what it means to even be in a nonprofit board service seat. So if you are a trustee and a member of a board of directors of a charitable organization, you are responsible for governing that organization. So take a step back and actually really think about what that means. It means that you are a fiduciary who's really in charge with steering that organization towards a sustainable future. And your job is to think about how you're going to help them adopt sound, ethical, legal, governance, and financial management policies. You are there to make sure that the nonprofit has adequate resources to advance the mission that they're telling you about. And you also are somebody who's really charged with faithfully carrying out that duty without, thinking about a situation of extravagance or waste. So that's a real responsibility that I like to underscore because it means something. And part of the most important function of that job is that you are in charge of overseeing the chief executive officer. So the person who's paid to come in day to day and run the organization, you are their boss. And that's one of the most important responsibilities of board service that implicates governance, is that you are overseeing the hiring, the compensation of that talented person who's going to be running the day-to-day management activities of the organization. And of course, this can look really different, as we'll talk shortly, depending on the stage of organization or the type of board that you're on. And three things that I keep in mind of sort of a succinct way to classify what it means to be on the board is something a mentor once told me. Your job is to provide foresight, oversight, and insight with respect to that board. And the way you're going to do that is by looking at the functions on this list, and you're going to go into every board meeting saying, that's my responsibility. And one key thing I'll underscore about nonprofit board service is you're typically doing this without compensation. So that's an important piece, just to manage expectations for those of you who are going to your first board seat. That all of the things I'll describe in this slide and others, you're really doing out of the goodness of your heart in service of that organization, which will look very different than what happens in the corporate world, where typically board members are compensated. So looking at the list, what are you doing when you're on this board? From a governance standpoint, these are sort of like the official duties you never want to neglect. You are protecting the public's interest, particularly as a public charity. That nonprofit exists to serve a mission and a public. You will have fiduciary duties and legal duties that are real under the law, that include loyalty and care that we'll talk about in more depth shortly. You are going to have to be very vigilant of conflict of interest, and that's in a very rigorous evaluation of your own interest in business and your particular role as they may relate to the activities of the nonprofit. And you're also going to have to constantly develop policies that might not exist that are integral to governance, or monitor the ones that are in place to make sure that they stay relevant to what the organization is doing. And all of this is kind of captured and more in that oversight function, where like if the organization is being steered, you are a critical piece of that puzzle. Now, beyond legal duties, there are real things you do to support the staff and leadership of the organization that you serve. And that's both being there for senior staff when they need strategic advice. You are also there to assist the organization in achieving their mission. This might mean, chairing a fundraiser. This might mean showing up for a volunteer day. You're an ambassador of the organization most times. I think 9 times out of 10, you are the person who is out in the community telling the story of that board and recruiting and cultivating the goodwill that they've established, or introducing new people to their mission. And another part of the duty of support that varies and shows up in different ways is you want to think about efficacy. Is the board doing, its best at being a board and serving the organization? And again, as we'll talk about shortly with different types of boards, this can either be a very rigorous process, or it can just be you self-examining when you're in that board meeting and saying, are we really doing things the best way we could? Should I be giving that CEO advice about how to better run a board meeting, how to think about communicating the mission differently, and others in service of whatever that organization is trying to achieve? Now, I'll add 2 disclaimers, because you're probably thinking, well, how am I going to do all of this, right? First, you have a right to information, and that can actually exist as a right under the law, particularly here in Massachusetts. The Attorney General's Office publishes a great guide for board members. And one thing I like to underscore when going over this massive list of responsibilities is that in order to carry out your legal responsibilities, you must be able to make informed judgments about matters affecting that organization. So the law actually says you can reasonably request information upon which you need to rely regarding, and from staff, lawyers, auditors, outside advisors. And if you don't have adequate information, you can demand that. Hopefully it wouldn't rise to that level, and that would tell you a lot about the tenor of the board if that happened. But keep in mind sort of that these duties really go with that complementary right that you have. And that is, of course, a reasonable access to the kinds of things you might want to see from senior management, like books and records, or matters that might implicate specialized knowledge around which you say, can I see what that consultant actually produced to guide this major strategic pivot? So you can use your judgment there, but know that you do have that right. And then also consider that these responsibilities are not carried out in a vacuum. So one duty that I like to put in the back of the mind of every board training I've done is to say, look around the room. You have a responsibility, probably with the nominating and governance committee, to make sure that there is actually a board that is diverse, that reflects the community that you serve, and that is skilled in carrying out together the function of oversight. And one area where I like to offer an anecdote when this becomes a real thing, as I once had a woman that I mentor say, I'm joining my first board, I'm so excited, but there's something a little weird in that there are 5 board members and 4 of them are families of the president. And I looked at this and I said, yeah, that's a little non-traditional because there's very little of what's called independence there. So you might want to see, is this a startup board? Is it going to always be like this? Because that might implicate the kinds of conversations you have when you're really having an oversight function over the person who's in charge. And I can give other examples if it's helpful, but that's, where these duties take on real meaning, and also you have to think about how you're going to do them. And now I'll ask Courtney to go to the next slide. So here, we're going to dive into an area that is probably, I will say, fairly dry. This is where we talk about what the law says you have to do. So we're going to call out specifically the fiduciary duty. And if you've never heard that term, I'm going to try and explain it in plain English, and then we're going to pause for questions. So, and this is an area that I will point out is very similar across nonprofits and for-profits board, because you as a board member are going to have some variation in conception of these duties, and it's going to be guided by state law, most, 9 times out of 10. So board of directors basically have to be cognizant of a couple of things. They have a duty of care, which means that you are going to act as a reasonable and prudent person would under the same circumstances, exercising the same care when you are looking at matters that come before you to decide on, to vote on, to think about in the context of that board meeting. The second really important duty is called the duty of loyalty. And this is another important fiduciary duty because what it means is that you really have to place the interests of the organization that you're on the board of before your own. And let me dive a little bit deeper and just give meaning to, like, what does this actually mean? And then we might talk about an example if it's helpful. So the duty of care requires generally really informed and attentive decision making. And this can mean knowing the law and corresponding requirements of your nonprofit, keeping tabs on daily activities, and then basing decisions on that knowledge, devoting the necessary attention to the organization and what it requires of directors to really act in what you fully and honestly believe is the most competent manner to make decisions. Easy ways that the duty of care is often violated is even where, let's say, the board never updates and keeps and makes present and available the organizing documents. So typically, for those who don't have a background in how nonprofits are formed, and even for-profit corporations, many corporations have a written document that says this is a blueprint of how we are organized. And they're called bylaws or articles of organization, articles of incorporation in the corporate setting. For nonprofits, if you have bylaws, and let's say they're way out of date, and you on a board have never received the bylaws and it's your 3rd year, that you have to ask yourself, am I really, upholding my duty of care? Do I have all of the information around which to make decisions? And that in and of itself, which sounds like a kind of an innocent mistake, can be something that you really have to take seriously in view of these duties. Now, what does it mean to have a duty of loyalty? Because we all have a sense of what loyalty means just as a person. In the setting of a board, you have the requirement to act in good faith and really pursue the organization's best interest. And this includes full disclosure of any issue that could cause or be perceived to cause a conflict of interest and recusing yourself from those discussions, both formal and informal. It's a really, really high standard. And part of what it also requires is that as a director, you do not take any opportunity away from the nonprofit for your personal gain. And you also really have to take that seriously in considering both your professional life and what you're doing and the business dealings of the board. You know, this is a very sticky area where all of us come in with relationships, and unintentionally, let's say, you know, you're on a board and every year they might ask you to say, disclose where you work, disclose whether your organization receives funding from, let's say, from us or similar funders. It can take many variations, but what you have to do is always take seriously that notion of acting in good faith in view of the organization's best interest. And we can get into some specific examples. But typically what you want to see is an organization that is attentive to this and asking you the right questions. The way that this manifests in reality is many boards send an annual conflict of interest disclosure form. When you get this, you know, they're not just being, let's say, a pain or a thorn in your side. They're actually trying to collect the information so that the individual charged with oversight at a staff level is attentive to providing the CEO and board members any indication that this rule might be violated. And I know that's a lot of information, so I think this is a first place where we're going to pause for questions, and Courtney might have a question or others that she's received.
Yeah, so please, thank you, Lourdes, and please share your questions in the chat box if you have any. You know, I was thinking through a number of the points that you reviewed. I especially liked, as your mentor shared, the foresight, oversight, and insight, really packaged in a way that we can hold on to, but also really comprehensive statement of our roles as directors. I agree the conflict of interest piece can be sticky and sometimes not as intuitive as we might think. Sometimes some conflicts of interest jump out, but others may take a little bit of time and thought to actually identify. And then to the duty of loyalty discussion. One question that popped into my mind, and I'll, again, please share your questions if you have any, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, you can do so. But one question that popped into my mind when we started this discussion on loyalty is serving on multiple nonprofit boards, right? I'm sure that's something that you had to talk about when you talk about this point. So will you give us an example or two, either from something you've read or heard or something you've experienced yourself, where these duties sort of come to life, and in particular, this duty of loyalty in the context of serving on the leadership boards of multiple organizations?
Definitely. So an example that could even be germane to your lives is, you know, let's say many people have multiple roles. And I once sat on a board where the board was doing what's called an RFP. So they wanted to hire somebody to do new marketing and social media. And there were folks on the board who worked in marketing and social media, and they had access to knowing that the board was going to put out a call for proposals, that they were going to be hiring somebody, even from a budget standpoint, how much money was going to be spent. So they had a lot of what you would call a sort of an inside track, an inside scoop into a business opportunity that really could help them. And there was a young woman said, you know, I'm about to start my own consulting business. Could I, you know, put my hat in the ring for this opportunity? And many of you are thinking, well, how would that feel, right? If the board member who has access to information and knew about it before the market of other people who run similar companies has that inside track. And if she went about it in an above board way, there could be a perfectly fine business relationship you can structure where she would actually disclose to the board that she's going to do this. She wouldn't participate when we vote on who's going to get chosen at the end. And where she also maybe excuses herself, where we discuss the terms of that proposal, the request for proposal process. And finally, where she would say, hey, if I want to get hired, maybe it's good form that I don't vote. And not only that, but that the majority of directors who aren't going to gain financially are the ones who approve that transaction. Because that way, at the end of the day, we don't want to miss out on having that great young woman who could be the right person for the job and has already demonstrated great service to the organization foreclose from putting her hat in the ring and doing the business. But we also don't want her to really trade on and have an advantage that the rest of the world doesn't, because that doesn't look good for the organization. That doesn't mean we're really doing our jobs as board members and both supporting somebody who could provide a great service. And I remember having that conversation on a board that I sat on with somebody who was in the middle of starting her own consultancy, went on to do it and actually did get hired. So it worked out great for both, but it was done in a way that felt really fair. And I always say, like, ask yourself sort of the smell test, like, what is this really, when you think about the situation, what do you think about it? If it wasn't happening to you, would it feel really fair? And often, even if there's a little bit of a misgiving, go with that gut and then really, act as you should.
Excellent. Thank you, Lourdes. I think, one point about our league experience, my league experience is brief, only a couple of years, but there has been a practical point that sort of ties back to this duty, and that is whenever we are selecting vendors to provide services, there's this requirement that we provide at least 3 quotes, and that's to give the board an opportunity to really see that we've been thoughtful about the selection process, that we're putting additional options in front of the board, and so that we're not cherry picking one individual organization and saying, okay, this is who we want you to go forward with. And then also too, to disclose, any relationships that we might have with that vendor or with the folks that we put forward. So these things do translate sometimes. This high level duty does translate sometimes into policy that then translates into practical steps that we have to execute even when we're not sitting on the board level. So, okay, so let's move on because I know we're limited with time. So now let's talk a little bit about the working board versus the governing board, which I know is another topic that's super germane to us. Go ahead.
Definitely. So when you are on a board, and again, this can look not just germane to nonprofits, but this can also happen in the corporate setting, particularly when you think of a startup board of a for-profit venture to a very established company. Companies can be at different stages, and nonprofits can as well, and that can impact how the board functions. So the notion of a working board would be where, for example, it's a small organization with limited staff, and your role on the board beyond the very real duties we've talked about can include going above and beyond and actually starting to mirror the work that would traditionally be done by staff. And that can be the kind of board that, and I'm not saying this in a negative connotation, but that really places an administrative burden on you as an individual, and you want to go into it with an awareness of that. An example would be a board that I served on many years ago, had one executive director for the organization. He had an assistant that was an administrative assistant, and that was it. And this was an organization that had over 500 members and ran programs monthly that were events, webinars, mentorship programs for students at college, high school age, really, really a lot of work. And the board was doing a lot of that work. The executive director clearly had a full-time job where he worked like 18 hours a day. But what we as a board would do beyond going to board meetings and providing strategic oversight is I would actually be making the email lists of who we were going to invite to an event. I would be sending the invites to all the speakers. I would be preparing the speakers. I had a committee of volunteers, and we were all unpaid, where we actually would show up and set up for the event. For not all of them, but we had multiple committees, each within thematic areas, and we were doing literally the work of an event staff. And we would still go to board meetings and have to be strategic. But outside of that, there was a lot of work between board meetings that was very real. And if that work didn't happen, the organization's programs would not happen, or they would happen in a much more limited capacity, only with what the executive director could do as one person. That's very different than a governing board. A governing board is where you come in and your role is that strategic oversight function, and you are focused on the big picture without neglecting the attentive responsibility to the details. But you are working as a collective body where really all of those managerial and administrative staff tasks have been delegated to staff members. There's an event team, so you don't have to do those things. There's a professional, typical like C level of support around the chief executive officer. And while as a board member, yes, you might be asked to speak at an event or to show up and volunteer one day, the work that happens in between board meetings tends to be more strategic rather than actually mirroring what staff roles are. And the way that this will matter is, one, you want to make sure that if you are on a working board, the lines aren't blurred in a way that the duty of care or loyalty might put you in a difficult position if, let's say, you're working on something that really would then be approved by your same board members, including you. And also that you just ask yourself, what's the time that I'm willing to give in order to fulfill my function if the board looks very different according to these two definitions. And I'll pause there for questions and any impressions Courtney might offer as well about her experience with these two types of boards.
Yeah, so I thought this particular discussion was very relevant for this group, because our league, just several years ago, um, went from a single governance group model to now this dual model where you have an executive management team that does more of the day-to-day, or we still have a staff, but you have another group of volunteer leaders who do the programmatic sort of execution part of our mission. And then we have now the board, who always existed, but now has more of the time and space to carry out the long-term planning and the strategic oversight that you described, Lourdes. And it, it's a transition to go from a working board model into a more dual leadership traditional model. So if there's anyone on the call, I'm fairly new to the organization, a couple years in, but we have folks on that are very senior and who've been with the league prior to this transition and now working with the league in leadership post-transition. If you have any insider questions or want to add to this discussion, please unmute yourself or share it with us in the chat. But this is a really important point. So Lourdes, actually, I wanted to ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
On this topic about a board experience that I've had in the past, and that is with a working board for an organization. My question is really around what are the legal duties that are implicated, because in one sense you have, well, in my experience, I had a board where everything in the organization was being done. There's no staff. Everything in the organization is being done by the board members. The president is the leader of the board, and also the leader of all of the working groups, if you will, or the committees. And so what I found was challenging is that when it came to funds allocation and those types of matters, as a board, when you're supposed to be sort of pulled back from a specific interest or investment in a particular group or committee, it's hard to do that when you are also sort of advocating for funds for your project, right? And so I think we can, on the surface, see how that could be a problem. But can you talk to us a little bit about what are the duties, that you see? What are the conflicts that you see sort of implicated in that type of structure? A little bit more below the surface than sort of what's obvious.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the example that you described is similar to so many civic and affinity organizations where you just don't have staff. And even though they generate a lot of money from members and programs, there's just not the ability, there is no ability to hire somebody to actually do those functions. So board members do everything in the committee structure in a non-compensated way. Part of what you want to do is be careful that what you're asked to do and the blurring of lines between, for example, allocation decisions about where money goes, the advocacy for that, and what ultimately happens with organizational spending doesn't reflect extravagance or waste or things that would rise to the level of violating the duties we described. And that can include the duty of loyalty care, but also a duty we didn't talk about that in Massachusetts, I believe, isn't a legal duty, but does exist in other states, called the duty of obedience. And this is that the board of directors has to be faithful and supportive of the organization's mission. And when you look at how that duty actually plays out, you have to really make sure that the organization is making the right kind of funding decisions, specifically that often triggers that duty of obedience, that directors are following the rules, that they're thinking about not using funds that should be for, let's say, for rent, for employee salaries, or executing a program for the community because they changed their minds after they said that their budget was set and approved, just because one board member advocated that the world has changed and money should now go here versus to where it was slated. And that can be really sticky because at the same time, there's just no staff to create the separation. So you almost have to, in your role, really wear two hats and say, while I'm advocating and I want to see this program get off the ground, if I wasn't me in both of these hats, what would be the prudent decision if I'm looking at this with the facts? Should the money stay where it is, or really do I want to push for that diversion to my program? Because otherwise you have to think about not just the program in a vacuum, but also the good of the organization overall and kind of its mission, purpose, and also adhering to policies around the budget too. You have to say, in advocating, am I asking for us to do something other than what in writing we say is going to be the way we steward these funds?
Absolutely. I know we want to move on into the financial financial discussion. So I'll pause here to see if we have any other questions from anyone. Yeah, it's a really tough to wear the two hats and to in the moment as situations present themselves, to even know sometimes this is a moment where I need to stop and take off this hat. And sometimes it's in hindsight or retrospect that we realize, oh, I may have been wearing the wrong hat. You talked a little bit earlier, Lourdes, about efficacy and the responsibility of a board to sort of reflect and make sure that it's operating at top notch, at its best, but to take a fine-tooth comb and say, okay, these are areas that we need to change or we need to improve in our systems and operations, in our policies, in our relationships amongst each other, in our checks and balances, whatever the like. And so when we talk about this particular example, it really leads me back to, okay, if we have board members or as a group, we're not doing a good job of changing our hats around the way that we need to, then it's that efficacy point that's going to cause us to sit down and really think about ways that we can kind of maneuver about that as we move forward. So I don't see any, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. And one way that the board can do that is to create at least a committee of the board that has a disinterested and isn't going to be, advocating to kind of serve as a check. But you're right. I mean, that's exactly the issue that tends to arise.
Just jotting down that committee of the board piece. I think that's a really salient point there. Okay, so I'm gonna move it on. I don't see any questions popping up. And everyone seems to be muted. So I'm going to move on to the next slide.
Yeah, and in the next slide, don't worry, we're not going to go over taxes, but I just wanted to show you a screenshot of one document that's super important, where if you're new to a board, you're going to say, let me put this in my notes as something that I'm going to want to see, depending on whether the organization meets the threshold to do this filing. And what does it mean for you when you think about governance? And we can also highlight an example of what it means to be in kind of one of those working boards versus a governing board. So what you're seeing here is called the 990 filing. This is what the IRS typically has, is, I would say, the version of your taxes for a nonprofit in layman's terms. It's a reporting form that tax-exempt organizations, 501c3s and nonprofits have to file with the IRS each year. And if they meet a certain revenue threshold, which I believe is 50,000, but I'm not a tax lawyer. And this form basically tells the IRS and the general public, what's the money behind your nonprofit operations. So it includes information also on your mission, your programs, but really your finances. And one of the things that the form does is it becomes a public document to the world. So many of you who go on a website called GuideStar, you could find the 990 filings for pretty much any nonprofit that's out there. It's a really robust database. And it's open to a lot of scrutiny, because this is also the place where executive compensation, your top compensated employees. So if you're paying your CEO, let's say 90% of your budget, they have to be reported as a top compensated employee, and the world will see that. It also has reporting on insider transactions, certain types of expenses. For example, if you decide that you want to do a little bit of lobbying and advocacy, you have to report how much of your budget did you actually spend on that, because the IRS really wants to know that as a public charity, what's the balance of how you're actually carrying out your activities financially. That matters. And your donors might want to know that too. This is a stark difference from the corporate world. You will not see this filing on a corporate board, but you're going to be seeing comparable versions of tax filings depending on whether you are a for-profit company that's publicly traded or not, whether it's an LLC or a C corporation, which we won't get into, but know that one of the key reasons why I'm showing you this form is to say that as a board member, if your organization qualifies to file a Form 990, which is, many nonprofits, you're going to want to see this because you have to approve it. Typically, as part of board governance, this is going to be how you will start building your checklist of things that you say, have I seen this during the year? And if not, let me at least ask a question. And the reason why as a board you want to take note of the 990 is because, again, it's easily one of the most scrutinized documents by third parties, and the criticism can spread really quickly with respect to the perception of an organization, despite whether or not the claims and criticisms are valid. So it can be helpful just to be aware of it. And looking at it as a board before it becomes a public document is part of that governance function. You want to make sure that the organization is providing the right context explanation and addressing weaknesses. One example that I want to underscore is, like, if you are on a working board, as we've talked about recently with that example we went over with Courtney, where there's just 0 staff and maybe there's not even one executive director, the board would be in a kind of a difficult position, because if you had to file a 990, you're both approving and developing. You're developing the document that you're going to approve. So that's a real blurred line there. But let's say, because somebody has to do it. Typically you hire an accountant, but depending on the resources of an organization, it's not out of the realm of possibility that somebody could say, hey, can you just do this tax form? Maybe you're a tax lawyer and you're my friend and you're on the board. So really think about what can happen where you're being asked to develop something that you later will have to approve in your oversight function. And if there's a mistake on it, typically boards that put you in that position should have insurance. So you want to at least add this to your checklist of things that you want to be aware of and ask when you join a board for the first time and start getting a feel for their operations. And it kind of also opens up the description of, if you're sitting here and saying, geez, I never thought about this, what else might you want to know financially to make sure that you're carrying out your duty of loyalty, your duty of care? So typically the basic stuff that you want to ask and see as sort of the behind the scenes relevant documents financially should be a budget. Not every board will actually get audited financials because, many organizations are just not at that stage and they don't need to make the expense to get audits every year. But a working budget that's actually true to the programs you are seeing come before the board. You want to make sure that that budget and the PC 990 have been developed with some measure of adequate internal accounting systems and controls at a minimum. And where you have, the person who's going to sign this, you want to see from a governance standpoint that there's been the right delegation of authority. So if you see a Form 990 and then you turn it around and say, wait a minute, why is the intern signing this? Or why is the chief development officer signing this? You might want to raise your hand and actually ask a question about that. And you don't have to be an expert in tax law. So I don't want to scare you guys into saying like, geez, I need to know everything about this. I'll tell you, I certainly don't know everything about this. And I've sat on some boards that, are very, I'd say well-established governing boards. At the end of the day, you want to use prudence and just say, am I looking at first that this is even being shared? Do I understand the function of the document, which is tax reporting, which is pretty serious? And is my conception of the budgetary documents I'm seeing and what I understand about compensation and key investments and the way we do and fund our work, like somehow accurately reflected in the numbers that you can distill in the way the mission is described to the IRS? If you're doing that, you're at least at a minimum, know enough to carry out that function meaningfully. And if you're not seeing the document at all, then you want to ask for it. And you also want to think about your role vis-a-vis an approver and other things that might be demanded of you if the board is, let's just say, one that falls in the working board category. And I'll pause just to see if Courtney has any questions. If not, I'll keep going towards what will be our last slide.
That meant go ahead on to the next slide.
Okay, great. So we'll move on to the next slide. And here what you're going to see, and I think we're still showing the PC 990, but whenever technology allows us to advance, what we have here is kind of a little bit of a recap checklist that I'll go over fairly slowly, just to make sure that we cover some basis of, if you, let's say, you've identified the first board you want to be on, and again, starting with a nonprofit board, and then I'll mention some corporate and government board differences just for comparison's sake. What should you know? What should be on your checklist of things you want to have from the beginning? So hopefully first they will do a training where you will, from the governance committee or the president or the chair of the board, will orient you into the organization. And one of the first documents, or a primary document you should be provided, is a copy of the bylaws. And if, let's say, you've already been serving on board committees or will serve on committees, you want to see if there are written charters. This is not indispensable, but basically a charter, if you've never heard of this, is just a document that says this is what the committee function, purpose, mission is. And also maybe when we meet, maybe the composition of our membership, maybe some key things that we have to make sure we do that are not just discretionary. This can become really important and is a point of distinction between corporate and nonprofit boards. Because let's say you're on a board of a publicly traded for-profit company, there are some real restrictions that an audit committee has to observe. Typically, you're going to want to see the charter of a written, the written charter for an audit committee in that setting above all other committees because of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and others. And you want to have that top of mind, whether you're on the committee or not, to say, hey, do we have this in writing of what our audit committee does? Because that's going to be a real area of risk. On a nonprofit board, charters are always good for good measure, and they can just serve as a guidepost to you on whether or not the organization takes governance really seriously and has just a lot of resources around putting in writing what's expected of members of committees that play a key role in governance. Again, you want to pay attention to financial matters, request tax forms, financials, and audits if they're not presented to the board already. In a corporate setting, this would be different because you might have a real high standard, including about financial disclosures at the individual member level. Because, for example, you have shareholders of a typical corporation. What happens if somebody wants to, is compensated and sells shares? And you want to actually screen for self-dealing. So you might have to have various levels of financial reporting that far exceed what happens in a nonprofit setting. But at a baseline, to prepare for either level of board service, you want to be very attentive to financial matters, including just audits, budgets, even if they're not presented to the board. Remember your right of information. Finally, and this point goes to both corporate and nonprofit, the conflict of interest screening process. You should have that at the beginning of your board service, and it should happen periodically, whether you're on a for-profit or nonprofit board, for the reasons that we talked about, because this really is a way that the duty of loyalty is screened for to make sure that everybody is compliant. And if you as a board member see that there's no process around this, ask yourself whether you're meeting your duty of care and not raising that question to the CEO saying, hey, how do we do this? What happens? How do I know that I'm not innocently violating this duty if nobody's asking me for the basics? Do we have a written policy around this? And as Courtney brought up before, efficacy matters. Not every leaders can be great, and not every leader will think about organizational efficacy at the board level. So you as a board member at least want to have in the back of your mind saying, maybe there should be a process, even informally and anecdotally, about where we do a gut check and say, are we doing the things we should be doing to best serve this organization in bringing our full capacities? I sit on one board that does a very structured process. I chair our nominating and governance committee, and every year we work with the University of New Hampshire and do like a really rigorous, it's over 100-question board survey. So we really go overboard on this, in a way that's been the tradition and practice, and we accelerate that process and do it biannually where we have board chairs that aren't changing. We do it annually where we know that a new board chair is coming in and they might want to really know what's going on and the way the board perceives their role, and also the role of the organization. But this can happen in a lot of forms. I've served on a lot of boards where we don't do this at all. And they're very sophisticated organizations and things run fine. But at least ask yourself, should you be having a question and answer session with the CEO where you at least are thinking about this issue, even if there's no formal process around it, because it can only be helpful to the organization to have board members who aren't afraid to self-assess. And then finally, always be present, engaged, and prepared. So it goes without saying that you want to go to board meetings. You want to attend meetings of committees on which you serve. You want to read all the material that you have, and you want to think critically about stuff. Don't just, I remember sitting on my first boards when I was in my early 20s, to not date myself. And I would be afraid because I was the youngest person in the room and people all sounded like they were talking about, and sometimes we're like, geez, is that really a good decision? But don't be afraid to really have confidence in your own judgment where something doesn't feel quite right or you think a question should be raised, because 9 times out of 10, you might have a really great point to offer. And even if it's that 1 out of 10 point where you just missed the boat and you didn't think about the issue the right way, what's the harm in airing that out? I think there's very little, because what can be gained from you adding your perspective is really why you're there. And that in and of itself, you're just discharging the duty of care. So that's what you should be there, sort of to put your thinking cap on. And I see a question that might have come in from the audience about whether I participated in a board evaluation process.
So that was for me to the group.
Okay.
Yeah, that's for me to the group as sort of a poll to the group. You know,
Okay, great.
have you participated in it? So if any of you on the call have participated in a board evaluation, been on a board that's done a more formal evaluation process, please let us know in the chat that you've done so, and maybe even we have you talk a bit about your experience. Lourdes, continue. Go ahead and continue. Sorry.
Oh, sure. No, I'll wrap up with only one more point. A lot of these principles, as I mentioned, sort of particularly the financial, will really apply to the corporate setting. You want to think about efficacy, conflict of interest, and some of those other points for in charters. We haven't talked a lot about government board service because it really is its own kettle of fish. As Courtney mentioned in the beginning, for 5 years and now still am in my 6th year of chairing the State Finance and Governance Board for Governor Baker. And it was my first government board experience, and everything we do from my duties are written in state law, including requirements that, we don't have any committees, we're just one board. As board chair, I have to host the meeting. We're subject to open meeting law, so I have to go through a really rigorous process of publishing everything we're going to act on to the world, and hold meetings where anybody could walk in if they want to, as the public should. We're subject to criticism. There have been times when people will, say, hey, I heard this in a board meeting. What did you mean? And I have to answer those questions if they ask. And we also have to do an annual written report that we distribute to every state authority within what the law says we have to report on, and take that really seriously. And everything from really observing down to like regulations. When we look at materials that come before the board, we have to say, have we checked the box of every piece of the code of mass regs when we're evaluating this in a way that is open to public scrutiny, should somebody want to see, because all of our records are subject to, open meeting law. And conflict of interest. Rules that apply to me are the ones that apply to paid state employees. So even though I do this as a purely volunteer without compensation, I can't violate the Massachusetts gift rules that employees would. So again, that whole process of serving on a government board could be its own webinar, but I did want to mention why so many of the things we've talked about feel very differently, if that's an area that you are interested in. And that in and of itself could be a separate conversation. But at the end of the day, board service, I don't want to lose this, can be super meaningful. It's a place where I have learned a lot of the skills that I brought professionally into my work. And I highly encourage and particularly want to underscore that we need more women to be attentive to these issues, to see themselves in these roles, and to be aware of the responsibility, so that when you join a board, you can really bring the best of yourself and every great idea you have in the right way, and really thrive, and hopefully go on to really use this as a professional development and personal development avenue. So with that, that concludes at least the prepared presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions for whatever time we have, which probably would be 10 minutes or so, or I'll leave that to Courtney.
Okay, so yes, so we have a few more minutes in our session, but Lourdes, please let us know. I know you have another appointment that you need to get to, so please let us know when you need to go. It's totally fine. We have a couple of additional points that I would like to discuss, but that are not necessarily part of the presentation or the substance that we've talked about so far. So let us know when you need to leave. One thing I wanted to say, I know that for some of us, this is a review, but for some, this may be very new, and it could be very intimidating and sound like a lot of responsibility. And it is a lot of responsibility. At the same time, though, it's totally manageable. And as lawyers, I think, sorry, I actually saw a question, so I'm trying to get to that question. Apologize, you all. Lourdes, can you see, because I've lost my chat box. Oh, yeah, that's you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's me.
Like I have a question. I can't find it. So it could seem intimidating and daunting. I understand if this is all new, and so I think our discussion today really gets into the nitty the nitty gritty of your legal responsibilities. And I will say, in my experience in Lourdes, maybe you might agree, is that not every board member executes on these responsibilities and duties flawlessly from the first day that they walk in, and even with the best intentions, so don't feel like if you're a very new board member that you sort of have to be on eggshells to make sure you don't make a mistake. It happens. I think the gist is to fundamentally understand these foundational points, which are, big picture duties, big picture ways of thinking, and try to approach, especially when it's time for you to make a decision, try to recenter yourself on these points and say, okay, have I considered this duty? Have I considered that duty? Have I considered this duty? Do I have the amount of information? Do I have the data points that I need in front of me in order to make this decision? Are there questions I should ask? And then, as Lourdes mentioned, freely ask those questions. I think, a mentor once told me the job of a board member is to ask the right questions. Always ask the right questions and be courageous enough to maybe ask the questions that everyone else might be, a little bit afraid to ask. That's the sign of a really good board member. So we do have a question from Leslie. So Leslie's question is, what difference is there for a board with outside directors versus board consisting of members who may well have participated in the work of the organization? Leslie, I think you mean like the programmatic executive execution function of the organization.
I'll start, and then Courtney, feel free to jump in. But I think that it would get at the degree to which there's a blurring of the lines on the issue we discussed earlier. I think the biggest risk, the benefit, to start with a positive, is that they will know the organization really well. So you've got board members coming in who are really ingrained into the mission. And what you want to do is make sure that if you're sitting with board members who are part of the organization, that they really understand the difference to having a governance and oversight function, so that there's no blurring of the lines when it comes for advocating for resources or seeing organizational decisions and evaluating in less than a kind of prudent manner up to that legal standard where you are saying, okay, what would another reasonable person do who wasn't part of the organization, looking at these facts to exercise their duty of care and loyalty, and also that if it implicates that duty of obedience. Because I really think that's the only risk, other than making sure that they have the right distance to also be able to challenge the CEO. I know that typically where I've seen boards who have a lot of folks who are very friendly with leadership, dynamics can get tricky at a real personal human level when tough decisions have to be made. And that's often, I think, the two areas of risk that I've seen.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the way, from my experience, there's often conflicts. There's often conflicts of interest that exist. There's often these issues that are gray and blurred. It's very rarely that we can build a board where these matters or these issues aren't present with us. Board construction is going to include people who are connected and in different types of spaces around our community. I think what it really comes down to, as I mentioned before, is how we act. And how, as an individual, we identify those gray spaces, and then how we handle them, or how, the actions that we take. And so in our decision making, making sure that we do, like Lourdes mentioned, taking off one hat and putting into in the other. I wouldn't say that, obviously one's circumstance or one board construction might lend itself to less conflicts, and so might be preferred, but that doesn't mean that the other construction has to be less effective. It just means that you have to take more care as you move through your various responsibilities in the group. So Lourdes, I'm going to stop here with questions or with my comments, because I know you need to run. Any last thoughts? Any last thoughts, or any tools that you think women who want to really nail these duties and responsibilities, really want to digest this, tools that they might seek or be able to kind of grab out their books, sources, anything like that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And first, I think you guys are doing a great thing, because I wish I had a series like this when I first joined a board. It was in my early 20s, and I was like, I don't know. I feel like I don't know what I'm doing sometimes. And I encourage women who don't have this great resource, and even if you do, to find a mentor as cheesy as it sounds, find somebody who even on the board or outside of the board has had board service and you can come to and just say, you know, am I asking the right questions? And also be easy with yourself. And what Courtney said before, and don't expect perfection. Nobody does. You know, show up and do your best. I think that's the most anybody can ask for. And if you do that in earnestness and with real care for the organization and their mission, and you're choosing boards not because you really care what's on your resume, but because you care about that organization and you know that you can give your time, knowing the stage that they're in, whether it's working or governance board, that you will be doing what you should. And, you know, nobody goes in knowing everything. So know that even the person who seems most seasoned on the board, they don't know everything either. And I've been in meetings where it's comforting to see people like, you know, and Eric Rosengren, who's chairman of the Fed, really think through issues out loud with other board members, because you understand that nobody comes in knowing everything. And that's the beauty of a board, is the collective coming together.
Right.
Resources that are helpful, the Attorney General's written guide, if you're on a board and really the screws are gonna be tight on figuring out stuff on your own, that's a great handy guide that goes over a lot of the points specific to Massachusetts. Find comparable guys if you're on boards on other states as well, and the laws might be a little bit tricky and different, and it's going to feel like it matters and you want to have that extra capacity. And ask your board chair if there is an orientation, even if they sit with you for 30 minutes. If they don't have one, always ask for that resource, because that's not, you're not showing your newbie side if it's your first board, but that's something that we do even with board members who are super sophisticated at United Way, for example, who come in and are, you know, leaders in the city who we know have sat on other boards, and we still say, hey, we do an orientation and you should come. And that's something that is that I can offer as a helpful tip to make sure you're not afraid to ask. But thank you for this opportunity. I've really enjoyed it and hope to just, you know, be supportive of any of you. If you should have further questions, don't hesitate to have Courtney give you my contact, and I'm happy to follow up.
Okay. Thank you, Lourdes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, appreciate it. And we'll see you. We will be in touch. I promise.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. And so ladies, before we go, I just wanted to go over a couple of other things. You know, I try in these sessions to give face, you know, in the event that we have guests that are not familiar with the league, to let them know who's in leadership. We know these three amazing women, so I won't spend much time, but I really wanted to go over this last point. And that is, you know, board seat initiative and ways to support what the work that we're trying to do as we move on through the rest of the year. And so, you know, what I wanted to put before you these different ways, but to say, you know, please consider enrolling in our certification program. Lourdes, as a member of the United Way Board of Directors, is extremely knowledgeable. And so she's given us just the tip of the iceberg into this very dense topic, but we are designing this program that's going to go, you know, much further into depth on these issues to really make sure that when you leave the program, you're really ready, prepared to be excellent board members who consider your duties consistently. That's one. But two, you might have heard her mention the importance of mentorship and relationships. And so another goal of our program is to help match you with other women who are leaders in this space so they can help to develop you after the course is over. So please consider enrolling in the course when it becomes available. To the extent that any of you are on boards currently and you know, the organization you serve with is looking for board members, please reach out to me on boardseatinitiative@jlboston.org and let me know about that. Or to the extent that you are interested, you are prepped, ready to go, and you're interested in serving on a board, please reach out to me. We're rolling out a more structured matching program, so you'll get a survey and you know, you'll be asking a lot of questions. But in the interim, while we're preparing that, please feel free to reach out just via email and share. Also, if you know folks who would be great on either of the panels, either as an instructor or on one of our Salon Series panels to talk to us about their experience, please feel free to suggest folks that we can reach out to and introduce to our program and introduce to the league. And you know, if you know folks who might want to host/sponsor any of our workshops, please feel free to let us know. there's so many different ways to be engaged in this. It's a very important work, not just to get people interested in board training or board leadership, I should say, but more importantly, to train them to be excellent board leaders. We should not take for granted that everyone who sits on a board is actually prepared and is doing a great job. And so, we want to set ourselves apart as being very intentional about preparing our women to be excellent in the board service that they do. So those are the comments I wanted to make. Are there any questions, comments, feedback? How are you all doing? I think we have a couple of minutes before we wrap up. Any thoughts from this session?
Hi, Courtney. This is wonderful. I thank you for setting this up. I thought, the information that we received today was great. And again, thanks for help setting this up.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. I know it was dense, really dense information. One thing I will say is, for our certification program, one of the reasons why we chose not to do it virtually and to have it in person is because it's so important to be able to stop and engage and talk and really digest these things. They can be very dense, it can be very heavy. And if you go through it too quickly without that personal interaction, some of it can go over your head. We're also designing the course to include some exams in there as well. So a little bit more motivation to make sure that we are asking questions and making sure we understand so that we can do well on the assessments. So that's all I have for today. Thank you for our repeat attendees. I really appreciate seeing your faces week after week after week. Our next session and final session right now, we may have another on the calendar soon, but our next session, final session, is next Wednesday, I believe, and that is going to be what we can learn about leadership from this pandemic. I think it's going to be a really exciting discussion. Another one that will be dense and fast moving, but one that you don't want to miss. So with that, thanks for participating, and I will hopefully see you all next week.